There's always very interesting questions in the comments section, and Rhea, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, leaves a lot of comments, and I very rarely pick them up and talk about them, and I should do so more often. So I'll do so today. You say that earlier this evening I reeled off a list of weapons he's proud the UK has supplied to Ukraine. I can't say pride is the issue, but yes. So it can force the Russians off its territory. I wonder if he will be so enthusiastic to supply a recognized Palestinian state with weapons so it can force the Israeli settlers off its territory, or will he suddenly discover the virtues of negotiation over war? Well, I always think negotiation over war is the better option, and anything else is a parody of what I've been saying over the months since President Putin's army walked into another sovereign state's territory. And I think Putin's army under Prigozhin and the various paramilitary organizations were already fomenting discord in the Donbass from before 2014. And those of us who were in Russia at that time were well aware of that process. And it was simply a matter of, was this going to lead to full-out war? If so, when? And what we could do to avert it and what was going to happen. And then President Zelensky took over with a plan to clean up Ukraine. And that was, from Putin's point of view, the last straw. Among other things that Zelensky wanted to do was to renegotiate the appalling Minsk agreements. So to impose on Zelensky and Ukraine the Minsk agreements which he was trying to renegotiate, to blame Ukraine for the war when it was clearly fomented by brigades of Prigozhin's men in the Donbass, is absurd. Anyway, the question of why it is appropriate to arm Ukraine but not to arm Gaza is a complex geopolitical, legal, and ethical issue. But mostly it comes down to the very simple fact that Zelensky is a democratically elected president who asked for help. And in the principle of democratic countries responding to democratic leaders who ask for help, in the face of aggression from an invading country, when it comes to war, it's always worth going back to the ethical principles set up in the Middle Ages, the idea of a just war. And while a country has a right to defend itself, proclaiming a war has to be done by an authority who has the right to make that proclamation. Now, the problem with Hamas is it's confused by its association with terrorism and the fact that it is a terrorist organization. Ukraine is recognized as a sovereign state and a member of the United Nations. And following the Russian invasion in 2022, Ukraine has exercised its right to self-defense as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Many countries and international organizations view providing arms to Ukraine as supporting a legitimate government's defense against external aggression. The Gaza Strip is a territory governed by Hamas, which is designated as a terrorist organization by many countries, including Britain and the United States, the European Union, and Israel. Arming Gaza is therefore seen as promoting support to a non-state terrorist actor engaged in violent actions against a recognized state that has simply responded to a serious terrorist to a serious terrorist act on October the 7th. supporting Gaza or supporting Hamas involves complex international legal and diplomatic issues in a way that supporting Ukraine does not. So, to start with, there's a legal problem. The civilian impact. Let's go to that, because that might be an easier problem to get round. Because the narrative supporting arming Ukraine often focuses on aiding the population under siege from an invading force, specifically Putin, and the aim is to restore and maintain Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, which is seen as defensive and a way to protect the civilian population. And the civilians are specifically being targeted by Putin. Of course, Putin is dead, Putin's in the Smeg fridge, but the people who are working in Putin's name. In Gaza, there's a significant concern that weapons provided to Hamas would be used in ways that exacerbate the conflict, build on the terrorist attack, leading to more civilian casualties on both sides. That is the defense by countries like the UK. And past conflicts have shown that military action in Gaza can provoke severe retaliatory strikes from Israel, leading to substantial civilian suffering, and that alone should justify some sort of response. So, what is the international response to that? The international response to that is aid, which Israel is preventing from getting through. And that is a problem. So, if you look at this from an ethical humanitarian point of view, from the point of view of the civilian impact, there is a case. There is a case for supporting Gaza as we support Ukraine, but I think not by sending weapons. There is certainly a case for condemning Israel's actions firmly and unequivocally, in the same way that we would condemn the actions of Russia. We might condemn the actions of certain Ukrainian units and certain Ukrainian actions. The Azov Brigade, I think, falls below the expectations that a civilized country should have of their fighting brigades, if everything that is said about them is true. But the people who were walking around with Nazi insignia were the Prigozhin-inspired Wagner Brigade. It's in the name Wagner. Then you can go to the geopolitical issues, the international relations and the wider security. So arming Ukraine is seen as a broader way to counter Russian expansionism. It's not about NATO expansion. It's about countering the Russian expansion. And the idea that NATO is trying to develop a power base in beyond Poland in Ukraine is an absurdity. It wasn't there. What Putin's actions have done is to increase NATO. In Scandinavia, for example. Putin has increased NATO. NATO was not stretching forward into Ukraine, though Ukraine was reaching out to see if it could become part of Europe, as indeed has Georgia reached out. But both Georgia and Ukraine have been attacked by Putin, both as part of a formal war and indeed as part of an infiltration for months, years in advance. So it's in the interests of NATO and the EU to try to maintain stability, to prevent further aggression in Europe by helping Ukraine, to prevent more poisonings, more assassinations. Because Putin's reach has got to Britain. Providing arms to Gaza does not do anything to stabilize the already volatile Middle East region. In fact, it could also undermine the peace process and provoke wider regional conflicts. The important thing here is to be very clear in condemning Netanyahu's continued pugilism and in trying to reach out to support the Palestinian civilian population. I've never disguised the fact that I think Netanyahu's actions, number one, are not going to result in success. And again, if you go back to the just war theory, not only do you have to have a leader who proclaims war, but that war has to be based on a possibility of success. And I don't think a war whose two aims were to eradicate Hamas, a terrorist organization, a guerrilla organization, that is not possible. Has he not read the 7 Pillars of Wisdom? And secondly, to release the hostages. And we have seen over 6 months those hostages are not being released except in a period of truce. The only hostages that we are seeing are dead hostages, and 3 of them were killed by the IDF themselves. So that's the geopolitical issue, and the instability in the region. We should not be adding to that instability. We should be trying to restore stability to the region. So in the same way as I believe sanctions are a very stupid way to respond to Putin, in helping Zelensky, we don't have to do what he asks. We just have to help him. He asked for sanctions. He was wrong. He's not experienced. I'm not experienced, but I can see that sanctions do not necessarily work. Sanctions cut off our access to Russia. And at a time when we are not at war with Russia, however bombastic Putin tries to sound, we are not at war with Russia. We should be at that negotiating table talking on Ukraine's behalf to try to get the Putin faction to take a more accommodating position. But there aren't people at that table because we're all playing the sanction game, which is a different type of war. And I don't think it's a war that can be won. The diplomatic considerations about trying to engineer peace in Ukraine and peace in Gaza, as I say, that would be better done if we weren't in the process of imposing sanctions. But supporting Ukraine with arms is often seen as a necessary step to create the conditions where diplomatic solutions can be pursued now. I would much rather we were in a position where we could be talking already to Lavrov. We fouled that up by putting Liz Truss at the table. Liz Truss, who hadn't done her homework and thought that Rostov-on-Don was part of Ukraine. Never. Although they do have an accent which is very similar. The idea is that a well-defended Ukraine could negotiate from a position of strength, or at least withstand aggression until a peaceful resolution is possible. A peaceful resolution will not be possible until Russia recognizes that Putin is dead. And even then, there will have to be a process of transition from the current hostile Kremlin authorities to something that reflects the broader understanding of the population. With Gaza, there's a significant international effort to resolve the conflict through diplomatic means, because we are not at war with Gaza or with Israel, though of course anything we say to recognize Palestine will automatically cut us off from the diplomatic relationship with Israel. As Israel has demonstrated with Spain, it's a very it's a very difficult tightrope to walk. Arming one side, especially a non-state actor like Hamas, is detrimental to the peace efforts and could undermine diplomatic initiatives aimed at achieving a long-term solution, a long-term resolution. The only resolution that is possible now in Israel is a two-state solution, and that needs to be imposed on Israel if it's not going to accept it or pursue it itself. Netanyahu is too weak to resist the pressure, I think, of international opprobrium about this, and I think he will have to accept, number one, a ceasefire which will lead to a permanent peace. A ceasefire on its own isn't worth pursuing. A permanent peace. And number two, a two-state solution. And that has to be presented as a package. But Rhea, I don't know what your background is, but this constant prodding, as if there's a case to be made to support Putin, is not one I'm ever going to capitulate to. I've shaken hands with the man. I don't intend to do so again, and I didn't know that I would be in that position all those years ago, and I wouldn't put myself in the position again. I consider him an evil individual. I also consider him dead, and if he's not physically dead, it's certainly not the person I see on camera is certainly not the same person who was in existence 10 years ago now. So, that's it.